you're maybe most famously known for your work in Motown. You were an engineer both on the recording side and as a mastering engineer. And of course, your career has spanned a lot more than your work at Motown, but that's really exciting to a lot of people. So maybe we can start with some of that.
I mean, we had the first tape recorders that you could punch in on
I heard
that
that it was 3 tracks back in the day.
we built in the shop. It was a 3 track.
Yeah. So I guess that
And
was at the time still pretty good. People nowadays have got unlimited tracks at their disposal, but
that
back
was,
then,
yeah, it was like 1960. Then in 1964, they built an 8 track. And Tom Dowd told me that we had the first working 8 track machine that you could overdub with. He had gotten an 8 track for Atlantic Records, but all they were doing was recording safeties of their live sessions.
okay.
They weren't doing I mean, we practically invented the modern production method
Yeah.
without knowing that. I mean, I didn't understand it until I got to California in 1972.
With punching in and yeah,
Comp,
overdubs and you were playing the artists were singing vocals, listening back over the speakers in the live room, right? They weren't wearing headphones mostly with speakers, right,
well,
back then.
no, they started the headphones in '64 when the 8 track
Okay.
happened.
Yeah.
So they were all, and I didn't get into the studio until '69. Before that, all I was doing was cutting.
You were the cutting engineer there before. That's quite a technical skill to have to cut a record.
It's a mono system, ES59 head and AM 131. And I'm amazed I'm remembering these numbers.
Yeah.
And everything else is homemade, the equalizers and
So what kind of stuff did you have access to back then? Because a lot of people nowadays, when they're mixing, they need a million compressors, a million EQs, and all of the effects. But back then you had 3 tracks, but they're 3 tracks to tape, right? How many tracks did you actually have on your recording console from the mic? How many microphones could you plug into the recording console and bust down to those 3 tracks?
well, the recording console had 6 inputs, and this is all the way to 16 track. We had 6 inputs on the
Hmm.
recording console, 8 homemade mic preamps that weren't
Okay.
in the console, but we could use,
Hmm.
and Ampex mixer and an Altic mixer. There
Nice.
were 4 inputs each.
Yeah, so you could chain a few different things together and get a few microphone inputs. Despite the fact you only had 3 tracks to tape, you could get a few more microphones out in the live room coming through.
Yeah,
And a lot of people have a different idea of how to record now to back then. Like now, the standard process is everyone plays in isolation and you layer each track over the tracks. I don't normally tend to record that way when I'm recording myself. I like to record with the band playing together if possible, especially for a lot of genres, yeah, jazz, more jammy sort of rock stuff. I know like super tight modern rock sort of benefits from that sound sometimes of layering everything individually. But what is your approach on the whole multi-tracking thing, one after another, versus the whole band playing live together in the room?
well, the whole band playing live together is way better because they give a better performance. I'd gladly sacrifice the sound quality for that. In fact, one of the biggest lessons I had was after I left Motown, I left to move to San Francisco. I was really, really shocked by how relatively primitive it was. And my
Mm,
dream had been to be in radio. I actually studied radio drama
okay.
beginning in the 8th grade through the 12th grade, 1 hour a day. 5 days a week in
Yeah.
school and learned all about how to use microphones, how to, especially figure-8 microphones, which were the most popular for radio.
Yeah.
Because,
Especially with their side rejection and stuff.
yeah, well, you could have a script underneath it and it wouldn't make any noise.
Yeah.
It's real basic.
I guess you
And
learned really great fundamentals from
yeah,
that
so I had
radio training.
wonderful fundamentals, and the two teachers had both been producers at NBC during World War II.
Mm.
And in fact, they had started before the war because
Okay.
radio broadcasting in the US was a whole lot of it was actually invented by women.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
People think nowadays that it's a very male biased
yeah.
industry.
The government offered big tax cuts to anybody who hired a veteran of the
Okay.
war. And so almost overnight, it turned into all men.
Yeah.
Women got
Yeah.
fired, and these two women had gotten fired and wound up teaching drama in school because they'd been radio drama producers. And so
Yeah.
I learned all of my basics from those two women who'd been at NBC, National Broadcasting Company.
Yeah.
And so what I had going for me is I could walk into a studio and I knew what I was looking at. I had a chance to fulfill some of that dream after I got to California because local radio station was operated by volunteers. It was a listener-supported station. And so I went over there and volunteered. And we found ourselves recording with two RCA 44 figure-8 mics and two Neumann, was the remote control version of the U67.
Okay.
289, I forget the number, but
Mm.
but anyway, it was recording bands with 4 mics.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, how good those came out.
Yeah. So you're saying it's all about the performance, right?
Yeah,
It's interesting. I recently did a video on my channel where I recorded a song twice. Once, all of the microphones are the same, everything's the same, I'm playing the same notes, everything's the same. But in recording A, I play with good technique, and recording B, I play with bad technique. And the difference between the two is really, really big. It's like the first one sounds like a song, and the second one sounds like a mess. And I didn't change anything. It's just the way I was playing. And I wanted to make the point that technique and the way that you play the performance is even more important sometimes than the equipment that you record with. Would
oh,
you agree with that to some extent?
oh, to a mind-boggling extent. I mean,
Yeah.
most people have no idea. I mean, I had a funny thing happen after I moved here to Nashville. One of the reasons I moved here was Bob Babbitt, who had played bass at Motown, was living here now. Well, when we got together, one of the first things that he asked was, "What did you guys do to get that sound at Motown?" He said, "I
Yeah.
never can get it anymore."
Hmm.
So I had him come over to my house and I plugged him in flat and he was listening to a studio monitor and there was the sound.
Yeah. It's just the way that
It
you
was
play.
all, it was in his fingers
Yeah.
and it was in the ear to finger loop.
Listening to those Motown records, the bass is really a standout part of it as well. Like everything is fantastic,
Yeah.
like of course, but I mean, especially for me, when I listen to them, I listen to the bass and think, wow, like there's something very special happening there. But what you're saying is that what the special thing that was happening was the bass player, and there was no special secret stuff happening with the recording technology. You were just plugging it in. right? Oh,
Well, we were plugging it in, but they were hearing themselves on a studio monitor and not an amp.
yeah. So they're hearing it how it sounds in the record.
So they're hearing that, and that completely changed their touch.
I can sort of guess your thoughts on sample replacement and auto tune and drum quantization and all of the modern stuff that people do to chop up the audio after they recorded it to enhance it and stuff. But what would you say to those kinds of technologies?
No, because the beginning of a note is not on the beat ever in the real world.
Yeah,
It's you know it's not the beginning of the sound. It's the so quantizing the beginning of the sound is more likely to screw it up than to help it.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I learned that one fairly quickly.
I've personally found that when you record a drummer who's just not got the feel and then you quantize everything, you spend half an hour doing it. Well, back in the day, I don't know, 15 years ago, I used to sit there and chop it all up, but now you've got really good automatic things. But when you do that, it just doesn't sound as good as if I just go out there and play it myself better or something, or if some other drummer goes and plays it better the first time.
Oh
And
yeah,
yeah, and I think that's really important.
and click tracks are another problem.
Yeah. So what do you think about click tracks? Because people think they're indispensable nowadays.
Forget it. The only
You're not a
time,
fan.
I mean, when they were originally used was in Hollywood because they were recording the sound after the picture was edited, and so they had to be a very specific length.
Ah,
And the only
okay.
way you could get that time to come out right was a click track.
Right.
And
So it
and then
was a
that
technical reason.
yeah, and then that extended to radio and TV commercials that had to be 30 seconds or 60 seconds.
Mm.
And so the purpose of the click track was to control the length of the performance.
Yeah. But
It
when you
was
start adding that to nice music, like yeah, R&B or soul or something like this, then you start to make it. You start to lose something there, especially from the rhythm section perspective in terms of like the groove, the
oh
shuffle vibes and stuff like this. It starts to degrade that sort of the soul in the beats,
oh
right?
the test actually is to breathe as though you were singing with it.
Mm.
I mean, you can feel your lungs tighten up.
Yeah,
I mean, once you start looking for the problems, what great music is all about is the musicians and the audience sharing the same heartbeat.
mm. Okay, that's a nice perspective.
And your heartbeat is related to your breath.
Mm.
So like if you sing along with something, you're entering the space that those musicians were in.
Yeah. So it's more of you think that it's got more of an emotional connection without the artificialness of dictating the
Yeah,
tempo with the click. Yeah, yeah, you've got more of a human connection there.
we only had one person who used a click track at Motown ever. But what I mean, when you're used to not having it, all of a sudden you really can tell.
Yeah, I guess if it's a deliberate choice to sound a bit different from what everyone else is doing at that studio, then yeah, that's an interesting approach. But I guess the a lot of the magic from Motown came from the naturalness and the human vibe that you got through the music. And
Oh yeah,
so you mentioned the guy's fingers on the bass just are the secret to the tone more than some sort of equipment thing. But if you think of something like a piano, it's just got keys. So how much
big time.
of that can be technique as well?
It's huge.
Yeah.
I used to be frustrated because the pianist who had played on the early Motown records had left, and the guy that replaced him got what I can only call is a mushy sound on the Steinway.
Okay.
And but the first guy got this big, clean, oh my God, incredible sound. And then one of our producers, Valerie Simpson, got that kind of sound out of the piano. And it was very, very frustrating that she would be in there showing the pianist a figure she wanted played, but then coming back into the control room and we're listening to the mushy sound.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more because I've recorded pianos a few times, not many times, but the times that I have recorded a piano, I've like a grand piano or something, I've always battled against that muffledness, the mushiness of what you're describing, and I think it has to do with the combination of of course, certain pianos sound darker than others, but really the attack that you get and the liveliness is about how hard and the technique of how you're playing the piano. There's so much in the technique there that it can change the sound more than a different piano can change the
It's
sound
the
sometimes.
technique, and it's also very interestingly, first time I recorded an electronic piano was with a guy who I had recorded a lot playing acoustic piano, who got an incredible sound. And lo and behold, part of his sound came out of that electronic piano that had no touch sensitivity.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
It was the placement of the notes was part of the clarity.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to believe that if you give Bernard Purdy or someone a toy drum kit, they're going to sound better than someone on a Gretsch or whatever. It's technique is such an important piece of the puzzle that I think people get carried away with this microphone and that microphone and well, if I just get a bunch of like Neumann KM86s and I'm going to sound like Marvin Gaye or something, but it's like, well, I think there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were real into Neumanns, but the reason we were real into Neumanns was because they were less prone to sibilance.
Oh, really? It's interesting.
And that was a big, I mean, sibilance and pops were the two big problems
Hmm.
for vinyl.
Yeah, for
And,
vinyl especially. Yeah.
and if you had a breath pop or sibilance, could wind up with a take that you couldn't use that was the best performance.
Yeah, because of the that might cause mm, yeah, technical cutting issues. Like too much sibilance can lead to
Yeah,
overhead the cutting head overheating and stuff like this, right? And all sorts of weird stuff.
yeah, it's a problem. so
Yeah.
so anyway, we kind of stuck with Neumann because it, especially the U67 didn't have a sibilance problem or a pop problem. We also, in an effort to simplify things and get more consistent results between engineers, in 1969, they moved, when they went 16 track, they also moved to all Neumann KM86s, which is a miniature three pattern.
Yeah.
And they did that because the favorite microphone of the engineers was a KM56, which
Hmm.
was the tube version of that. So we had all 86s. The only thing is the 86 was flat down to DC and had a pop problem.
Ah.
So we had to learn how to not pop, which interestingly you can teach a singer just having them say pop, pop, move their hand around, and they can find exactly where to put the microphone.
Yeah. That's a great thing. Like,
Yeah, so anyway, we dealt with that. But of course, digital eliminated that problem, but to some degree created problems of its own, which, although the biggest problem was not enough analog headroom in the gear. If you start treating -10 as zero, all of a sudden your sound improves a great deal with a lot of equipment. Problem is the designers thought, okay, well, it clips digitally at 0, so there should be no problem with the analog stage clipping at 0.
Okay.
Not true, but a lot of equipment was designed that way. The stuff that wasn't designed that way was the ultra high end expensive stuff.
Well, in terms of the technological advancements at Motown, you went from like 3 tracks and a DIY console back in the day to you had one of the first 16 tracks in the country, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you had your hand in the recording of Marvin Gaye's um, uh, track, like "What's Going On," and that was recorded on a 16 track, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken, right? Nice. You because that has like lots of overdubs and it's a lot more complex in terms of the recording. And listening to that, you can really hear the creative possibilities that were opened up by having 16 tracks with all of those overdubs and great stuff that you hear in that song. Is a very compositionally um, like layered, complex song compared to um, some earlier Motown stuff. That was like a big, maybe a big breakthrough in the sound. Or what was your perspective on what 16 track enabled you to do back then?
I mean, it was really nice. It changed how you approached things. I mean, the main problem is that the our old machines again had way more analog headroom, and so we had to learn to record at lower levels because the transistor gear didn't sound very good at a higher level than the tube.
Yeah, because you got more pleasant overdrive when it was pushed with the tube gear, but the transistor gear was a bit more harsh.
Yeah, well, in reality, it had less dynamic range. Depending, I mean, the problem is that the way they specify dynamic range was a marketing thing. I mean, if you define dynamic range as the ratio from unacceptable noise to unacceptable distortion, the tube gear had another 10 dB of dynamic range because 1% harmonic distortion just doesn't bother you. It isn't that we
Mm.
loved the distortion. It's that we loved, we could just record and not sweat the level.
Yeah, it seems that the audio industry has a bit of a habit of getting into uh, marketing claims that may not live up in reality. And I guess that was another case of it all the way back then with the advent of more transistor gear. They were trying to sell it to people with the advantage of it being cleaner or whatever. But when it actually came down to it, you could squeeze more dynamic range out of the old tube gear. That's nice.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I actually, the way I learned that was a friend of mine built a prototype gear for a guy named Dean Jensen. And one of the things he built was a microphone preamp. It was a
Mm.
solid state microphone preamp, but it had as much dynamic range as a tube dynamic. And lo and behold, there it was with what I thought of as that tube sound.
Oh, okay. So the tube sound didn't really have as much to do with tubes as it did to do with the dynamic range or the way that you could use it.
Was dynamic range.
Yeah.
It was unacceptable noise to unacceptable distortion.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a lot of people pay a lot of money for tube gear or this vintage gear that people were using back in the 60s. But back in the 60s, people just wanted basic stuff like less noise, better dynamic range, better frequency response, um, less types of distortion, intermodulation distortion, and all of the negative things. People just wanted to capture recordings with less weird stuff messing it up, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because often it's not the first take is a good one. So it's been very amazing witnessing the whole evolution of this stuff.
Well, going from the original more primitive equipment to getting really high quality, high fidelity equipment, and then people paying so much money to go back to the old stuff that you were happy to get rid of.
Yeah. Or some of the old stuff that wasn't very reliable. The classic item is the Fairchild
Okay.
670 limiter. It was sold as a mastering limiter.
Yeah.
Everybody tried it, and a lot of people didn't like it. And so it got dispatched into the studio from the mastering room because it wasn't considered good enough for mastering.
Yeah. And now people are paying like a crazy amounts of money
Yeah,
to get hold of those things now. But back then, you didn't
yeah,
even want them. You chucked them out the
yeah.
mastering room
And
and put them into the other room.
we didn't like it because you had to completely replace all the tubes about every 3 months, or it
Really?
wouldn't meet factory specs. I mean,
Yeah.
just 8 tubes.
Yeah. Yeah, tubes aren't that cheap either. And they've got a bunch in the Fairchild units. They've got quite a few tubes as well.
Yeah, well, they were a lot less back then because they were still building them. But now, like with the Fairchild, I don't think anybody makes the original tubes anymore.
Back then in the Motown studio, which was so famous because of all of those great recordings, everyone talks about how great and warm and amazing the recordings sound. We've talked a bit about how a lot of that came from technique, but I think some of that might have come from acoustics as well to a certain extent, maybe a much lesser extent than the technique. But I find it fascinating how such a modest size live room gave rise to such great music. And I've heard that part of that recipe of the acoustics is attributed to RCA's technology in
Yes.
acoustic design. Have you got any inside information on the acoustics of that room?
Well, it was really good. It was based on RCA's design, more or less modified for low budget. And the idea of it was that the reverberation bouncing from the walls would have a flat response. I mean, that was the goal, to have very uncolored bleed, and
Yeah,
indeed it did. I mean, we had no idea how good it was until we went elsewhere. Universal Audio was doing a model of the echo chambers that John had built. And so we all got together at the studio, and it was quite something.
well, that was another secret part of the Motown sound, right? You had a big echo chamber in the attic, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, well, 3 of them actually in 3 houses
Yeah,
next to each
yeah,
other.
because Motown Studios was uh, wasn't it like formerly a photo studio or something, and it was like previously a house, and then it was converted, and then it was a photo studio, and then it was a recording studio, and then they bought more houses and joined them together. What was going on there?
Yeah. Oh, God. At one point, I think there were about 8 houses, 5 on one side of the street and 3 on the other.
So that was real, like modular scaling of the operation.
Yeah.
And I guess the echo chambers were a big part of the sound as well, because having a quite modest size live room, you didn't have that much ambience. You had really great sounding ambience, like you already uh, touched upon with the RCA room treatment. It looks like they've got like pegboard with fiberglass behind or something like that to reflect the highs a tiny
The
bit.
lower part of the room was, I mean, the room was also designed for vertical. And it was set up so that the musicians sitting down, their ears were at a level where the response would be flat, but where their instruments were, there was a pegboard over fiberglass all around the bottom of the studio. So
Okay.
the idea was that it was dead down low, and then the two optimum places for your ears were either sitting or standing.
So that's where the pegboard was, to reflect some of the highs back in the room and not to
Yeah,
completely kill the high frequencies in the room.
flatten the response.
Nice. That's a really smart design. And nowadays, a lot of people are using quadratic diffusers and stuff like that. But even back then, they had the right idea with the pegboard and the fiberglass. Because I think RCA put a lot of effort into their research into audio back in the day, and yeah, that trickled down to the great sounding records from Motown, I guess.
Yeah, well, one of the tricks is that we were their biggest pressing customer.
I guess that buys some special relationships with
They
their.
did so we had access to a lot of stuff that you wouldn't normally have, that the competition didn't have. I mean, for example, the final production manufactured records were all mastered by RCA because RCA would guarantee no skipping. And RCA had the ability to put 100,000 records across the nation overnight, which nobody else had that size. So we
Yeah,
would typically do an initial release on RCA, and then the reorders would all be done by independent pressing plants using metalwork from RCA. So what we were doing in the cutting room was creating the prototypes for RCA. In other words,
mm,
our job was to cut it as loud as we possibly could and not have a skipping problem. And then
yeah.
RCA was expected to meet that. And they were sent an acetate along with the tape and told, this is what we want.
It's nice to get these kinds of insights into the process back then, because today it's so different.
And the reason for cutting hot was simply that if you went into a radio station production meeting, or some of them called it a music meeting, they would be playing 45 singles. They'd be going through boxes of new releases to decide what they were going to play. And so your record had to be as loud. I mean, everybody who had ever attended one of those meetings watched somebody throw out a really good record because it wasn't loud enough.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the loudness war started.
They weren't taking the time to adjust the volume for each one. They would put on
Yeah,
the record, and if it didn't get them in 15 or 20 seconds, into the wastebasket.
yeah. And so the loudness war was started.
And so that's what we were having to meet with the volume.
And it in
And
terms of the room, you talked about in the early days you had six or maybe even eight mics uh, possible in the live room, but ultimately back then you didn't really have a close miking mentality, right? Because nowadays far too many people have what I call a close miking mentality, where you see it in multi tracks that people will send something through, and the drum overheads aren't called overheads, but they're called cymbal mics, for example. When I see that, I think they're not cymbal mics. They're not cymbal
yeah,
mics. They're overheads because it's capturing the sound of the drum kit. And but they think that it's capturing the sound of the cymbals, and then you have the sound of the cymbals and the sound of the snare and the sound of the kick and the sound of the tom, and you add them all together, and then you get a drum kit. But that's upside down in my way of thinking, and I'm assuming
yeah,
maybe
you're
your
right.
way of thinking as well. Yeah, you start with the sound of the kit, and then if you want to add in individual elements to that to increase the punch of the
Exactly.
kick or whatever you have in mind, then you can do that. But you need to start with a sound, right? And so, what was the approach back in the Motown days? It was a lot more of a holistic whole sound, right, rather than an isolated
Yeah.
close miking.
Well, drum setup was an overhead, a snare mic, a hi hat mic, a floor tom mic, and a bass drum mic.
Yeah,
And they were all mixed into the overhead.
yeah. So you start
or
with the overhead, and
yeah,
that's the sound, and then
yeah.
you mix in the spot, and that's exactly how I approach mixing when I mix today. But far too many people I see start with the kick drum, then the snare drum, then the whatever else, and then the last thing that they mix in is a tiny bit of the overheads just to give a bit of sizzle of the cymbals. And by that time, I think it sounds all a bit too unnatural for me.
Oh God, I don't know. One thing we did. I mean, originally the only thing we separated was the bass drum on its own track. And that was simply because it was considered important. And then later on, we would put the snare on its own track, and then everything else either in mono or later on in stereo.
And after you left, you did music for film and recording all sorts of bands. I heard you worked out of um, the Skywalker Studios, and you did a lot of recording. But what have you been doing in more recent times? Have you mostly been doing recording or more mastering?
Almost all mastering. Done a little bit of recording 10 years ago, but that was simply because I had the opportunity. We sort of put together the ultimate R&B band, which was Bob Babbitt and Ed Green, who played drums on like Barry White and all that stuff.
Oh,
Babbitt and Green were considered the absolute kings of R&B bass and drums. And they were flown
mm.
all over the country to work and the whole thing. So I got to work with them. So we had the two of
Nice.
them, and then I told Tom Dowd about working with that, and he said, "Oh, you got to get him with Reggie Young." So I
Mm.
got a hold of Reggie Young, and he was happy to play on our sessions. And then the other person we got, interestingly, playing rhythm guitar was Dave Hungate, who turned out to be a better rhythm guitar player than anybody else I've run into, even though he's known as a bass player. He's a spectacular rhythm guitar player. And so him playing rhythm and Reggie Young playing lead. And we had various piano players at times, all really good session players. And that group
Mm.
we recorded, and it was just incredible. I mean, they were good. In fact, the funniest lesson that I got was I had a hunch that you could make as good a recording in Pro Tools as you could on tape, and having those guys proved it.
Yeah, it didn't matter about tape or Pro Tools at that point. You've got the best guys there, and what's coming through
Yeah,
the microphones is like the difference between tape and digital is maybe, let's say, 1 out of 10 difference, but the difference between having those guys versus some less skilled players is going to be like a 10 out of 10 difference.
oh, it was great. I did learn that it was better recorded at 96.
Yeah, because that is a bit of a controversial point. A lot of people still argue that 44.1 is sufficient, but I think there's many engineers who say that 96, 192 sounds a bit overkill. Maybe it's not necessary, but 96 is really the pinnacle of digital recording. A lot of people agree.
You hear it more with live music than the typical overdub thing. I mean, that's where with live music it becomes obvious that it's better. Well, we were comparing MP3s of the same setup recorded at 44.1 and recorded at 96 and then converted to MP3s. And the
Mm.
converted MP3s were obviously better.
From 96K.
Yeah,
Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to have to try that out myself.
it was more obvious than comparing the raw digital.
Ah, yeah, that could have something to do with the codec and the way that the codec works. That's an interesting thing that I'd be up for checking out. I'll do a comparison myself as well and see see if I can reproduce what you were
And
seeing on your side.
the other thing that's interesting is that there are benefits to recording at 96 and then actually low passing between 24 and 30K. So it's not about the bandwidth, it's about the distortion.
So that's really interesting about the. So you were saying that recording at 96 and then low passing had benefits over recording at 44.1. I guess that has something to do with the reconstruction filter able to be less steep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would sound like that's something that I would be interested in testing as well. That sounds pretty cool. That's something because I'm currently developing some plugins, and that's something that I'm currently dealing with oversampling. It's a really interesting and technical place which I'm quite interested in, actually. So it's interesting you mentioned that. Let's talk about mastering briefly before we wrap up the interview, because I'm a mastering engineer, so I'm very interested in your work too. And so in recent years, obviously you've had the loudness war and a lot of people starting to do their own mastering using various things like Isotope Ozone or whatever other plugins that have been introduced into the scene. What are your thoughts on mastering in the modern world with loudness and streaming and people doing their own mastering?
Well, certainly you can go too far. I'm just finishing a project that's actually very interesting because it's benefiting from a lot of compression, which I haven't experienced before. But it has to do with the balances are not great. And so I'm finding that I'm compressing it with a Massenburg compressor, which is very transparent compressor, depending on the song, from 1.5 to 1 to 3 to 1 ratios.
But you say that's more of an exception. You generally don't use a lot of compression when you do
No,
mastering
I'm
normally.
not great. I use very little.
That's interesting because my approach is similar. Um, my approach has always been to get the EQ right driving into the limiter. And then if you need compression, it's more of an anomaly or an exception rather than a rule.
Oh, the compression is to limit the amount of limiting needed.
Yeah. Everyone seems to be throwing the kitchen sink at their tracks in the mastering process nowadays. We've got like compressors, exciters, and clippers, and all sorts of things that they're putting in the signal path. And the end result, to me, sounds over processed and unnatural. I'd much prefer masters that have been processed with a more conservative approach, getting the tonality right, and then the right amount of limiting that's appropriate. And if they've only used a limiter and EQ, that can often sound better than throwing everything at it, all of the host of plugins that people will have access to nowadays. And
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Well, I try a lot of different stuff.
Mm.
And, is this better or is this worse?
Mm. Yeah.
And wind up with interesting combinations. You're in trouble if you try and use a formula.
Yeah. would you say that your approach, despite the fact that you like to experiment, errs on the side of being more conservative with processing in mastering?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty
Cool.
much. I mean, the first mastering session I ever attended where somebody was mastering one of my mixes
Okay.
was at the mastering lab in LA with Doug Sachs.
Wow. Cool.
And I learned a lot from that. In the 1970s, I was still doing quite a bit of work to tape, and I did mastering sessions with Sachs and with Bernie Grunman and with Bob Ludwig. And
The giants in the field.
my dream would have been Bob Ludwig using Doug Sax's gear.
Okay. Bernie Grumman's got pretty nice gear as well. He's got a lot of bespoke nice stuff.
Yeah, but it's less. I mean, Sax's was pretty incredible.
Well,
His brother built it all.
oh really? I didn't know that. We've discussed quite a lot of really interesting things. I think a lot of people don't have access to this information just on the internet. Hearing it from the people who are actually there at the time is really interesting from a historical point of view on how these records were made and yeah, the technology of audio engineering. So I'm really grateful for the conversation. If people want to find out more about your work and what you're up to, have you got a website that you could share with us?
Yeah, it's fairly primitive and hasn't changed in a long time, but it's called hyperback.com. hyperback.com. And so there's a website that I haven't changed a whole lot in 10 years, but there's bits and pieces on that. And then I also post online in a variety of places. And
Like Gearspace, or where can
yeah,
people get in contact? Gearspace is a good bet.
yeah, I have to use the ignore thing a lot there, but because
Okay.
otherwise I get a flood of crazy messages in my email.
Yeah.
But I found if I aggressively decided who to ignore, well, part of it is I was actually helped run the first pro audio mailing list.
Okay.
It was called
What was that called?
rec.pro. And in that, I discovered that you usually had, out of maybe 100 people, 4 or 5 crazies was what would bring the whole thing down.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I take a similar approach with Gearspace. And
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I find being on YouTube, I see a certain similar pattern.
I mean, I realized I learned more as a fly on the wall about the music business at Motown than half the people running his labels today know, which is
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah, it was just such a great setup and a great place to be a part of. That must have been a really great experience and a fun time.
Yeah. Well, I've had a very fun life. Like, I was really lucky. I got in really young. I got in before it became an in thing to be a recording engineer, before Glenn Johns turned it into a space for stars. So I got to have a great career and a lot of fun and get a lot of support from my wife.
Well, that's a really nice place
Yeah.
to leave it, I think. We've had a great conversation, and thank you so much for coming on the channel and sharing everything that you've been discussing today. It's been great, and I guess we'll leave it there then for today.
Okay.